always nice. I was talking to a preacher, this was a couple years ago, and I've thought about this a lot since then. It's one of the only occupations out there in the world where you can take off and somebody can just hop in and do your job for you, and a lot of times do better than you did it. So thankful for Ryan for filling in last week. While we were at the lectureships, there was one particular lecture, and the preacher, as he was preaching, gave an example, which I'm going to regurgitate to you, about Andrew Carnegie. Andrew Carnegie, of course, the still man, right, at the turn of the century, 1800s into the early 1900s before his death. This guy, he owned basically all the steel, especially on the East Coast, but basically in the world. He was asked, as he was interviewed, he was asked by someone in the audience, Mr. Carnegie, what is the most important part of industry? Is it labor? Is it resources or brains, or is it capital? And after thinking for a moment, Mr. Carnegie replied, which is the most important leg of a three-legged stool? A couple years ago, Brittany asked me to build a three-legged stool for our kids. It didn't work. And the kids could sit on it, and the stool worked fine, unless you have wiggly kids. All those legs are important. And thinking about that, the God, in a matter of speaking, has the three-legged stool. Three-legged stool, in order to get to heaven, right? In order to be with him, every single one of those legs is absolutely essential. The leg of grace, faith, obedience. If you take one of those legs away, you're going to be like our kids. You're going to fall flat on your rear end. It ain't going to work. Now, if you think about it, two of those three legs depend on you, right? One of those legs is what God is doing, or what God has already done, what God has offered, and those other two legs, well, that's completely up to you. And if you take away one of those legs, you're going to end up on your hindquarters. So this morning, thinking about that, using those three legs as suppose our 3 points, we're looking at three different scriptures in correlation to each of those. And thinking about grace, the leg of grace, I don't know that there's a better passage to turn to than what we find in Ephesians chapter 2, which is where we're headed. But you remember Ephesians, he's battling with this idea of these Jews who are trying their very best to not only be a part of the church, but also to bring in some of the old law and to bind the old law. In Ephesians chapter 2, in particular, he's talking about how in the past, without God, we're deader than dead, right? But because God and what Jesus has done, as long as we obey and as long as we have the faith, God's grace is going to cover us. We're going to read 8 through 9, but if you go on down to verse 10, you're going to see the part of obedience as well. So read 8, 9 with me in Ephesians chapter 2. For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not your own doing. It is a gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. There's two basic thoughts and they all point to the main idea here. The two basic thoughts that are presented is, it all comes back to the benevolence and the great goodness of God. The thought of, it's not you who's doing it, right? It's not you who is working. Grace does not depend on merits. In fact, as a child in Bible class, I learned very early on that the definition of grace, unmerited favor, right? Nothing that you can earn, nothing that you can do, that's grace. So the first thing, it is not of your own doing, later on reiterated basically the same way. It's not a result of works. This other idea is that it is a gift of God, which is essentially, other places, grace is translated as gift. It's this charitable, gracious, omnibenevolent, all good God who bestows a gift on us that we do not deserve, that we can't earn it. You go to work every week, and at the end of the week, your boss gives you a great gift, doesn't he? No, he gives you what you earned, right? At the end of our life, God gives us grace. In this, he gives us grace. It's not anything that we could earn. It is only because of God. God is the only one that can save us. Now, having said that, don't you dare go so far to say that you're saved by grace. That's where John Calvin went wrong, right? He inserted this word, alone. Saved by grace alone. Well, no, that's not what it says. Now, we are saved, and we are only saved because God is the one that can save us. It reminds me of a story. I don't know if you're following along in the daily Bible reading that you find on the bulletin. If you are, I hope you are, or if not, I hope you, at the very least, you're spending time in God's Word every day. But if you are following along, it was just last week, maybe the week before that we read the story about Gideon. It's one of my favorite stories in the whole Bible because it is about God saving his people in a crazy, obscure way, right? So we begin in Judges chapter 7 with the story of, or in chapter 6 with the story of Gideon. Oh, mighty man of valor, he's threshing wheat. He's scared to death. He's threshing wheat in the winepress down in a carved out place, hidden because the Midianite oppression. He goes and tears down the altar or the Asherah at night. He's scared to death. But in chapter 7 of the book of Judges, there are 32,000 people that rally behind Gideon in order to stop the oppression of the Midianites. 32,000. Well, that's a lot of people, unless you skip on ahead, and it's described the Midianites come against the Israelites. It is described as an innumerable amount of people with all their camels and all their lives. It is an innumerable, unable to be counted. So if you skip ahead and you look at chapter 8, you look at verse 10, do a little calculation. We've got 32,000 people against 8 verse 10, 135. Well, the odds aren't so good anymore, are they? 135,000. That's roughly the city limits of Evansville, right? You take 32,000 people and you pit them against the city limits of Evansville. Well, it's not going so good. But this is what God says in chapter 7 and verse 2. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many. I don't think so, God. The people with you are too many. Important fact at the end. For me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. in order for me to give the Midianites into your hand. 32,000 too many. And then you skip on down after we get rid of a few thousand. Gideon turns to the army of 32 and he says, anybody who's scared, go home. 22,000 people leave. Now, if you're not so good at math, that's about a third, 2/3. You're left with a third. 66. That's the majority. Anybody who's scared wants to go home. Well, everybody gone. So you're left with 10,000. And the Lord, in verse 4, the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water and I will test them. And then, of course, they go down to the water. It depends on the way that they drink. We are left with 300. Now, again, we are at odds with 135,000, give or take one or two. 135,000 people, the city of Evansville versus 300. So you take us, all the people here, and you add a few more people, just a few, and we take on the city of Evansville. Pass, right? Hard pass. But they do it. They do it. And here's the crazy thing. They do it with no weapons, right? They don't even have, in their hands, the end of chapter 7, if you keep reading, says they have a torch and a jar and a trumpet. Where's the sword? But they defeat the Midianites with innumerable odds. One person to every 450. Here's the point. This, in my opinion, is one example of God's grace. You aren't able to do it by yourself, right? There's no way. Even if you're the very best at what this is only because of God. 1 to 450, 300 against 135,000. It is only because of God. But you got to remember, right? For by grace you have been saved, verse 8 says, for by grace you have been saved through faith. Gideon believed. Gideon did it. For by grace you have been saved. The important part, another key, another leg to our stool is that it is through faith, right? You have to have faith. Unless you believe, unless you have the faith that God's grace is going to cover your sins, unless you have the faith, right, that is required in order to believe that Jesus is who he claims to be, that God is who he is, there is no salvation. Looking at the book of Hebrews in chapter 11, where we're headed, this chapter, I mean, it's familiar to most of you. And if not, allow me to summarize it very quickly. You take the Old Testament, boil it down to one chapter, and you have chapter 11, okay? That's basically it. This leg of God's salvation, it's about faith. Having faith. Chapter 11 is about having faith. Read verse 6 with me. And without faith, it is impossible to please him. For whoever would draw near to God, right? There's our salvation. For whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. You gotta believe. You gotta have this faith that we're talking about, because you cannot be saved without faith. You have to have it. If you follow along in Hebrews chapter 11, you are going to find the words by faith no less than 17 times in this chapter. By faith, by faith, by faith. All these people of the Old Testament, they acted by faith. They did what they did, and it was by faith. Their faith, listen to me, their faith controlled their lives. By faith, Abel. By faith, Abraham. By faith, Sarah. By faith, Abraham again. By faith, Moses. By faith. You keep going down the line. All these people live their life by faith. Y'all, we can't get to God without that leg of faith. But another common theme that's often overlooked in the book of Hebrews is action. Their faith moved them to do something, right? By faith, they did it. Think about that. There's this verse, if you're in this adult class that David's teaching, there's this verse that he's been drilling in our heads almost to an annoying degree. In John chapter 20. But guess what? It comes to my mind when I'm thinking about faith. This is what it says, John chapter 20, verse 30 and verse 31. We're going to add a little bit to it. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But, look at it, these are written so that you may believe. These are written so that you may believe. There's our faith. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. You follow me? If you want life, you got to believe. There is life at the end of faith. In order, it is impossible. It is absolutely impossible to please God without faith. That's what verse 6 says back in Hebrews chapter 11. Because you got to believe that he exists, that he is going to reward you if you diligently seek him. And that's what Hebrews chapter 11 is about, those who are diligently seeking God through their faith. Their faith moved them to action. Chapter 11, it is dripping, just saturated with verbs. In fact, most of those by faith statements are followed by an action. By faith, Abel offered. By faith, Enoch was taken. By faith, Abraham obeyed. By faith, Sarah herself received power. By faith, by faith, by faith means by action, by action, by action. I would challenge you, and this is a very, very enlightening, at least in my mind, very enlightening study. And it's very short, very quick. Go through Hebrews chapter 11. Highlight, circle, or whatever you want to do. Every verb that you see. And you're hardly not going to be able to read your page because of all the verbs. By faith means to obey God. If you have faith, if you want to please him, then you will obey him. And without faith, it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who, seek him. You've got to obey. Obeying God is essential to your faith. Obedience. That's the third leg of salvation. You're standing on that stool. Take away the leg of obedience, you're going to fall. Just a couple of pages later, you're in Hebrews chapter 11. Just a couple of pages later, in James chapter 2. This is the complementary passage to Romans chapter 10, Romans chapter 11, Hebrews chapter 11. Because when we combine these and when we take them as it was meant to be taken, we find the necessity for obedience. I'm going to read 14 through 26, and I know it's lengthy. Just stick with me, okay? What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, "You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith apart from works, and I will show you my faith by my works." You believe that God is one, you do well. But even the demons believe and shudder. Do you want to be shown, you foolish person, that faith apart from works is useless? Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up his son Isaac on the altar? You see, faith was active along with his works, and faith was completed by his works. And the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. And he was called a friend of God. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers, sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Obedience. You see it? You can look at Hebrews chapter 11. You can look at Romans chapter 11. You can look at all these other passages in the Bible and miss the boat. Come to this wrong conclusion that all you have to do is believe. All you got to do is depend on God. No. Faith, verse 22, was completed by works. Bring your faith to completion. You see, faith without works, faith without obedience, it's worthless, right? I mean, that's one of the things that he says here is faith without works is absolutely, it's worthless. Look at verse 14, verse 20, repeat it again. What good is it? It's useless at the end of verse 20. It has no value. Faith without works. Also repeated twice. Faith without works is dead. Verse 17, verse 26. Faith without works is dead. Also invaluable. Dead faith. Then if you look here at the end in verse 26, faith without obedience, without works, it's incomplete. Faith, you're missing a big piece of the puzzle. All right. So let's put the rubber on the road. You've got faith, right? That's why you're here, is because of your faith. You believe that God is who he claims. You believe that Jesus, you believe in the Spirit, you believe all those things. And that's great, and you're here. But if you leave here and do nothing about it, what is the point? If you leave this place, if you believe that God is who he claims to be, and you go out and you live the life that you absolutely want to do, throwing care to the wind, it is absolutely pointless for you to believe. Even, it says, even the demons believe and shudder. Verse 19. If all you do in life is sit in that same spot in the pew in the back, it's no good. I would even add to that, if I could be so bold as to add to the word. Even the demons believe and shudder. Even the demons, every single encounter that we have, Jesus has with the demons that's recorded for us, the demons are confessing and proclaiming the truth about Jesus. You can have faith, and you can depend on that grace of God. But if you add that leg of obedience, your stool's going to fall. Our children, like I said, they're pretty wiggly worms. They'd sit on that stool and for about 30 seconds, and then they'd lean back and right on their behinds. The good thing about God's stool, not my stool, God's stool, is that it's solidified. Because of his grace that covers us. As long as we have the faith that we need to. And as long as we couple and prove that faith with our obedience, we'll stand before God's judgment seat with confidence. If you're not ready for that moment to stand before God, if you need to put your faith in action, be baptized, start living the faithful life like those people of old, maybe you need to come back. Won't you do that as we stand and as we sing?